Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to look at the history of the fraternity, the history of Freemasonry, and what brings us up is, obviously, there's a lot there. There's a lot to deal with, but also, about a year ago, I read John Dickie's landmark book, The Craft. It's a fantastic book. The author is actually an expert in the mafia, and historical expert, PhD, teaches in England. Brilliant guy. And it's interesting because in 2013, he basically said the mafia is Freemasonry for criminals, to which the United Grand Lodge of England reached out and said, hey, we're not, come on and see us. And he wasn't sure what was going to happen, but they gave him access to pretty much everything. And so he wrote a one-off book on the history of Masonry. It's really an interesting deep dive into it because he has no connection to the fraternity whatsoever. So he does get into some really muddy areas. That being said, obviously we're going to generalize and summarize a lot of what's going on there, as well as some other sources that we're all familiar with. Mackey, historical sources, looking at my background in history and art history, and the like. So our focus today is the history of Blue Lodge Masonry, the story of the 3 degrees, the organization of the early lodges, the emergence of the familiar structure that we would recognize as Masonry today. This story spans centuries. It crosses borders, national identities, wars, intellectual movements, and revolutions. It is filled with kings, craftsmen, philosophers, spies, idealists, and sometimes even scoundrels, not all of which we'll get into here. Freemasonry is not simply a set of rituals or ethical lessons. It's a cultural force that's really shaped the Western world, Western society for the last, 300 years. So settle in while we trace a long arc of Blue Lodge Masonry to understand where we were and maybe where we may go in the future. But let's start with medieval stonemasons and the birth of the old charges. To begin, we travel back to the Middle Ages, not some candlelit tavern of secret oaths, and not yet the Enlightenment. Instead, we start with stone. Massive cathedrals rose across Europe, primarily Northern Europe and France, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, during the 12th and 13th centuries. They required complex geometry, engineering, and a highly skilled labor force, and they would organize themselves, as all of these different groups would, into guilds or fraternities. And this is where we find the earliest seeds of Freemasonry. These medieval Masons were not philosophers. They were practical builders whose craft required mobility, confidentiality, and standards of training. They would travel from site to site following work. And I should point out, while the cathedrals took 150 years to build frequently, what would happen is you would have a situation where the cathedral would be built for, say, 10 years, and then the money would run out, and you would need to travel to another cathedral to work there, and then that money would run out, you'd travel to another one, or maybe back to the first. This happened quite frequently. Remember, society is not as stable then as it is today. And they would carry with them a reputation for expertise and reliability, a reputation that they needed to be able to carry in a time without communication from site to site. To preserve that reputation, they would develop rules. These rules survive in manuscripts called the Old Charges. Dickie spent considerable time examining these documents because they revealed something vital. They contain moral instructions, creation narratives, and rules for behavior blended with professional regulation. This mixture of operative practice and moral obligation is the clay from which Masonry would be formed. The Old Charges speak of the history of the craft, often invoking biblical figures. Other figures as well, people such as Euclid, Noah, or others, in imaginative attempts to dignify their trade. They're not trying to create a history, they're trying to dignify and provide credibility to what they do. But they also insist that Masons should avoid conflict, pay their debt, obey their masters, and live uprightly. In other words, a medieval stonemason was expected to be a moral man as well as a skilled one. The idea that a community of craftsmen might enforce ethical rules within its membership is the earliest hint of what Masonry would one day become. And here I need to throw on my history hat for a second. This is actually really common amongst all of the craft guilds that we see throughout Europe. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with the Wool Guild in Florence, Italy, or the Cloth Guild in Bruges. At the end of the day, they always have moral standards, because if one person in that guild gives the guild a bad name, that will affect their market. That will affect their ability to control production and sales. So it becomes incredibly important to lay down some kind of rules. So how do we get from this very practical form to ideas? Well, for centuries, these operatives guilds persisted in various forms. But by the 17th century, the 1600s, change is beginning to sweep across Europe. Cathedrals are not being built on the same monumental scale. They had basically topped out. And political turmoil disrupted many old institutions, primarily due to the Reformation. As Dickie narrates, the guilds began to shrink. Some lodges would attempt to preserve themselves by admitting non-operative members, men who were not Masons. And what we're going to see is politicians, royalty, and others jumping into these lodges, taking over that form for their own political means, and then using that to create something that gives them credibility. Again, kind of connecting back to something earlier than ourselves to give ourselves credibility. Very common amongst societies, peoples, etc. These early speculative Masons were often local gentlemen, landowners, scholars, merchants, and town leaders. Why did they join? For some, it was social networking. Let's assume you're a merchant for a moment. The idea is that you can network with maybe local royalty, a local baron, or perhaps with other merchants, guilds, and groups that might be represented within that craft. For others, it's an appeal of a ritualized fraternity, and for some others, it was curiosity. The idea of belonging to an ancient tradition, one that blends practical skill with moral teaching, was particularly attractive at the time. What it did is it provided universalism without the conflict, which was at the center of all Christian, Protestant, and Catholic religions at the time in the 16th and 17th centuries. So there's a lot going on. These non-operative members introduced new ideas. The scientific revolution was underway. New philosophies about reason and human nature circulated widely. Protestant countries, particularly Scotland and England, would be embroiled in religious warfare and religious change. We see everything from the War of the Roses to the constant conflict between Catholic and Protestant in England, just as one example. So many of these individuals sought fellowship defined not by religion or politics, but by shared universal values, the universalism of Freemasonry. That's where it's coming from. They're trying to sit there and say, you know what, we want the lessons, we want the ideas of religion without the hierarchy, which is leading to the massive conflict, which is burning across Europe at the time. What emerges was something entirely new. And when I say emerges, I'm talking something that happens over a couple of centuries. The lodge, once a workshop, becomes a place for personal improvement, philosophical conversation, and ritual instruction. Masonry is no longer just a trade, it becomes an idea. So this brings us up to 1717, the founding of the premier Grand Lodge. Now we arrive at the foundational moment. Dickie begins his main narrative here because it marks the birth of organized Freemasonry as we know it, even though it existed earlier in smaller forms, individual lodges that would slowly come together into something that would be a recognizable system. On June 24th, 1717, representatives of 4 London lodges met at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern. And from this meeting, we find the emergence of the premier Grand Lodge of England, the first centralized Masonic authority in the world. Up until this point, as I said, Masonry existed, but there is no centralization. There is no center of control. The ritual would have been different in different lodges. The ideas, the lessons may have varied, sometimes quite profoundly, between lodges. The ideas, the base ideas would have been the same, but how they get there would have been different. Why did they gather? Well, several motivations likely converge. First, they want to stabilize ritual and authority. Second, they want to rejuvenate declining lodges by creating a sense of coherence across London. Third, they saw an opportunity. Lodges were becoming fashionable meeting places for men eager to join something modern yet ancient, rational yet symbolic, very similar to the salons and cafes that we see across Paris a century later. The idea is that this is a place that I can meet with other people of like mind and compare ideas, develop myself. That's the whole self-improvement of Masonry. Freemasonry was about to become a cultural phenomenon. And by the way, I'm just going to, again, throw on my historian's hat for a moment. London is not an accident. A lot of Freemasonry appears to have developed in Scotland before coming down into England. By setting things up in London, you are at the center of power. The king, the parliament, everyone in power lives or visits London on a regular basis. So the idea is to place yourself at the center. It's the same reason the Catholic Church will center itself on Rome and not someplace like Alexandria, Jerusalem, or Antioch in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. So there is a reason this is happening here. It is really taking Freemasonry and the roots of it, which really do develop more or less in Scotland and Northern England, and it pulls them down to that center of power. With a Grand Lodge comes structure. They are now officers, annual feasts, a Grand Master, and the beginnings of what would one day become the Blue Lodge. But in these early years, ritual is still fluid, creative, and often chaotic. The degrees would have looked different depending on what lodge you went to. By 1723, we see James Anderson, a Scottish Presbyterian minister, publish the Constitutions of Freemasons. This document, familiar to many of us, was commissioned by the Grand Lodge and codified this new speculative Masonry. Dickie argues that Anderson's work is revolutionary because it blended myth, morality, and the Enlightenment thinking into a single text. The Constitution offered 2 essential ingredients that shape Blue Lodge Masonry as we know it today. First, they present a mythic history that connects the craft to ancient civilizations, similar to the Greeks connecting themselves to the Egyptians who came before, similar to the Romans attaching themselves to the Greeks, or the church connecting itself to the Romans. As I've said, we do this all the time. This narrative was imaginative, but served an important purpose. It gave Freemasonry a certain cultural weight and dignity. Second, Anderson laid down rules of conduct. The famous charge instructing Masons to avoid political and religious disputes in lodge is first found here. That instruction stabilized Masonry in a divided society and contributed to its rapid growth. It allowed Masons of differing backgrounds to sit together peaceably under one roof, whether they were royalty or a farmer, although at this point we don't see farmers. This is very upper middle class and up sort of society within Masonry. The constitutions formalized what many had already sensed. Freemasonry was this new kind of fraternity, harmonizing diverse men through shared ritual and ethical instruction. Again, that universal instruction that moves beyond the hierarchy of religion into really universal virtues. So now we come to this period between 1725 and 1770, and Freemasonry is expanding rapidly. And this is at a speed rarely seen in organizations. Now, here's where Freemasonry gets lucky. I mean, they do a number of times, but I have to be honest. oftentimes we tend to think, well, Freemasonry did something really right. It did, but it also got ridiculously lucky because at the time Freemasonry is expanding, the British Empire is also expanding, which means lodges begin to appear in Ireland, Scotland, but also places like France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and of course into the American colonies, the Caribbean, India, and Africa. Now, Dickie attributes this spread to several different factors. One is the Enlightenment. Freemasonry offered a moral system compatible with reason rather than dogma. In other words, it's based on logic rather than some kind of religious hierarchy or religious dogma. It celebrated virtue, self-improvement, and human dignity. For many, it felt like a sanctuary from the political and religious turmoil that really rocked Europe in the couple of centuries following the Reformation. Another factor was sociability. The 18th century saw a rise in coffee houses, clubs, reading societies, and dining groups. If you lived in an urban environment in Northern Europe at the time, the idea of socializing is suddenly becoming very, very popular. The idea of comparing and sharing ideas. Masonry emerged at precisely the right moment to become one of the most successful of these organizations. A third factor was ritual. Freemasonry offered symbolism, drama, and mystery. The degrees, even in their early evolving form, had emotional power. They created bonds that simple social clubs couldn't match. And this growth, this development is part of the reason why the church in about 1737 first puts out an encyclical stating that Freemasonry is simply not going to be compatible with Catholicism. It's because it's expanding. They're concerned about the universalism. They're concerned about the influence on society. And part of it is a misunderstanding of what Freemasonry really is. Across Europe, lodges become centers of conversation, charity, and sometimes controversy. Rulers alternately welcomed and banned them. Philosophers debated their meaning. Artists and musicians drew inspiration from their symbols. And the structure of Freemasonry slowly standardized. We see, especially in the period between 1717 and about 1730, the formal development of the apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason degree. The lodge becomes a recognizable institution to the point where the London Times actually runs a complete ritual of Freemasonry in about 1728 or so. And this is important because the reason they're doing it, the reason those early texts are out there that talk about, like Pritchard, illustrations of Freemasonry in around 1730, is because so many people want to be part of this, or at least try and convince others that they're part of it, that it becomes a major social phenomena. Blue Lodge Masonry as we know it really takes form. If you were dropped into 1717, you probably would not have recognized Freemasonry, and they probably would not recognize you. By the time we get to the 1750s or so, you're probably beginning to recognize Freemasonry as we know it today. I'm going to split this into 2 episodes because we still have more to deal with. We have to deal with the schism, Freemasonry in America. We have to deal with the anti-Masonic movement, the school of virtue ideas. There's several more things. The history of Freemasonry is never easy, and really, we're just scratching the surface. We're not getting into the depths that John Dickie does in his book, The Craft. So, until next time, thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Leakey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.